Today we will explore the languages that shaped the medieval world, from the plains of Europe to the caravan routes of Central Asia, discovering how language was much more than a simple means of communication, but a force capable of uniting empires, dividing peoples, and crossing centuries. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this. Imagine for a moment that you could walk through the medieval world, not the world of castles and knights that movies often portray, but the real world of merchants, monks, scribes, and travelers, a world where every crossed border could mean a new language, a new alphabet, a new way of understanding reality. This is the world we are going to explore together, following the sounds and words that connected, separated, and transformed entire civilizations over centuries. To comprehend this vast panorama, it is necessary to begin where many medieval stories start, in the ruins of the Roman Empire. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, it left behind much more than roads and aqueducts. It left a language. Latin survived the empire that had created it, and this survival was not accidental. For centuries, Latin remained the dominant written language in Western Europe, the closest thing the region possessed to a shared international tongue. Bishops corresponded in Latin. Monarchs signed letters in Latin. Monks copied manuscripts in Latin. Even though the Roman legionaries had disappeared generations ago, Latin continued to connect rulers, religious figures, and scholars across long distances, being the default choice for texts intended to circulate beyond a single community. But there was a profound paradox in this survival. The Latin that persisted was, for the most part, a written language, not a spoken one. Full literacy was restricted to a few, and classical Latin, that of the polished elegance of the authors of antiquity, was accessible mainly to those who had received a formal education, especially clerics and certain members of the elite. For most people, Latin was something they encountered in the church, in public documents, or through the few educated people who knew how to read and write. And medieval Latin was not static. Over the centuries, it changed in noticeable, though still recognizable ways. Writers introduced new vocabulary for Christian life and the new institutions that were emerging. Grammar sometimes became more direct than classical models, shaped by local speech habits. Some authors deliberately imitated ancient patterns, while others wrote a more practical, functional Latin geared toward daily life. Thus, medieval Latin covered a broad spectrum, from the highly classicizing to the frankly utilitarian, depending on who was writing and for what purpose. While Latin maintained this formal role, in the streets and in the fields, something very different was happening. As Latin became increasingly a language of education and writing, the everyday speech of Western Europe continued to drift, region by region, until it was no longer simply Latin with an accent, but a family of distinct languages that scholars would call the Romance languages. People still recognized common roots between neighboring regions, but mutual understanding became progressively more difficult as pronunciation transformed and local vocabulary accumulated over generations. In the territory we now call France, these changes produced multiple dialects. To the north, the so-called langues d'oil, ancestors of modern French, were grouped. To the south, Occitan flourished with its own literary and cultural traditions. Over time, a northern variety, strongly associated with royal administration and cultural influence, became increasingly dominant, and French gradually emerged as a widely recognized written language alongside Latin. This process can be observed in the growing use of French in legal records and literary works, even while Latin remained central in many formal contexts. In Italy, the pattern was similar, but with different results. The peninsula developed a dense mosaic of vernaculars, Tuscan, Venetian, Neapolitan, and many others, each with its own peculiarities. Tuscan would eventually gain enormous prestige thanks to great writers and its association with powerful city-states, becoming the basis of standard Italian centuries later. Meanwhile, in the Iberian Peninsula, several Romance languages developed side by side, ancestral forms of Castilian, Catalan, and Galician Portuguese, shaped by constantly moving borders, migrations, and the contact between Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities. What modern readers know as Spanish becomes more visible as Castilian grows in prestige as the language of royal power and literature, used progressively in writing alongside, and eventually in place, of Latin. While Latin and its daughters dominated Western Europe, a parallel and equally fascinating story was unfolding further north and east. The Germanic languages spread across a vast zone, from the British Isles and Scandinavia to the regions of the Franks and the German-speaking peoples, and their transformations throughout the medieval period were so profound that the oldest forms can seem like completely foreign languages to the contemporary reader. In England, the main language of the early Middle Ages was Old English, which prevailed approximately until the 11th century. It was a heavily inflected Germanic language, with grammatical case endings and a vocabulary that sounds quite strange today. After the Norman conquest of 1066, the linguistic panorama of the island was radically transformed. French became dominant in elite culture for a time, and English changed rapidly in sound, spelling, and grammar. In the late medieval period, Middle English, used approximately between the 12th and 15th centuries, was already much closer to modern English. Many case endings disappeared, word order became more important, and the vocabulary expanded dramatically with large contingents of loanwords from French and Latin. In Scandinavia, Old Norse was the shared ancestor of the modern languages of the North Germanic group: Icelandic, Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish. Spoken not only in Scandinavia, but also in the Norse colonies scattered. Across the North Atlantic, Old Norse preserved a relatively complex grammar and is preserved in a rich literary body, especially in Iceland. Throughout the late medieval period, regional variants progressively separated, giving rise to the modern Nordic languages we know today. In the regions that today correspond to Germany, Austria, and parts of Switzerland, medieval linguistic history is described in terms of stages: Old High German in the early Middle Ages and Middle High German in the High Middle Ages, covering approximately from 1050 to 1350. The latter is closely associated with courtly literature and reveals great sound changes, grammatical evolution, and a clearer sense of regional literary standards. Moving eastward, another great chapter of the history of medieval languages was revealed in the Slavic territories. Throughout Eastern Europe, most people spoke Slavic languages, a large family of related tongues that stretched from the Balkans to the forests, and riverside cities of what would later become Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. For those who traveled through the world of Orthodox Christianity, one language in particular was essential for the life of the Church: Church Slavonic. It was not the everyday speech of most people, but it was widely used for religious writing and helped connect communities in different Slavic regions. This language also spread along with the Cyrillic alphabet, which became the main writing system in many areas influenced by Byzantium. In Kievan Ruses and the Russian states that followed, people spoke varieties of East Slavic, while many written texts, especially religious ones, showed strong influence from Church Slavonic. And because this region was situated between large cultural zones, a traveler might encounter abundant linguistic overlap: Latin and German to the west, Greek to the south, and Turkic-speaking peoples on the steppes. Depending on where one was, the language could reveal the faith of the interlocutor, their commercial connections, or which political world they felt closest to. And no story about medieval languages would be complete without speaking of Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, which held a linguistic heritage as complex as its own history. The Byzantine Empire was born as the eastern half of the Roman Empire, so Latin was originally the official language of the imperial government and law. However, the Eastern Mediterranean had long been predominantly Greek-speaking, and over time Greek replaced Latin in administration. By the early Middle Ages, Greek had become the primary visible language in government documents, education, and most of public life in Byzantium, while Latin persisted mainly in certain legal traditions and in contacts with the West. The Greek of Byzantium was not exactly the Greek of the authors of antiquity, nor yet modern Greek. Pronunciation and everyday grammar changed over the centuries, and medieval writers frequently used new Christian vocabulary, At the same time, educated Byzantines admired ancient literature, so formal writing could be deliberately antiquated in style, and the Greek read in a chronicle could sound older than the Greek people spoke at home. Furthermore, Byzantium was never just Greek. It was a multilingual empire, especially in the border regions and the great commercial centers. One could find Armenian in the east, Slavic languages in the Balkans, and Syriac in Christian communities of the Near East, while Arabic was important in the border zones, in diplomacy, and in trade. In many places, people navigated daily life in local languages, using Greek when dealing with the state or the ecclesiastical hierarchy. And it was precisely on the borders of this Greco-Roman world that one of the greatest linguistic revolutions in medieval history began to take shape. From the 7th century onward, Arabic emerged as one of the most important languages of the medieval world. As Islamic rule spread through the Middle East, North Africa, and advanced into parts of Europe and Central Asia, Arabic accompanied it, first as the language of a new political and religious order, and then as a practical language for administration, scholarship, and long-distance communication. Over time, it became a shared written language for an enormous region, visible in everything from legal documents to inscriptions and scientific and philosophical works. A fundamental reason why Arabic could spread so widely is that the written language remained relatively stable, even while speech varied greatly from place to place. The Arabic used in the Quran and in formal writing provided a common reference point across all regions. But in daily life, people spoke regional forms that could sound quite different in pronunciation, vocabulary, and even some grammatical aspects. Someone from Morocco and someone from Iraq could read the same formal Arabic, but find each other's everyday speech harder to comprehend. Nor did Arabic replace earlier languages overnight. Before becoming dominant in many areas, Aramaic had long been an important language in the Near East. Syriac, an important literary form of Aramaic, remained especially relevant among Christian communities for religious writing and learning. In many places, these languages continued alongside Arabic for centuries, creating a multilingual panorama where people might hear one language at home, another in church, and encounter Arabic in broader public life. This pattern of coexistence between languages would be repeated, with variations, throughout the extent of the medieval world, including the vast African continent. In North Africa, Arabic became the language most used in cities and in long-distance communication, but it coexisted with the Amazigh languages, widely spoken in the Maghreb and the Sahara. In the Nile Valley, Coptic continued as the language of Egyptian Christian communities, and in Ethiopia, Ge'ez served as the written and liturgical language for Christian texts, preserved in manuscripts and inside churches for centuries. Across West Africa, Arabic became important for Islamic learning, sometimes being used to write local languages in Arabic script, a practice called ajami, while large linguistic families like the Mandi languages and Songhai shaped everyday communication. On the eastern coast, Swahili developed as a major coastal language with strong influences from Arabic, the result of the intense commercial connections of the Indian Ocean. Back on the Asian continent, a different language had conquered a unique role on the routes connecting the Mediterranean to India and beyond. Persian became one of the great bridge languages of the medieval world, especially through Iran and Central Asia, and later in parts of South Asia. In the medieval period, a new written standard, often called New Persian, gained prominence and spread widely, becoming a prestige language in sophisticated contexts. In many kingdoms and empires east of the Mediterranean, Persian was found in official correspondence, court poetry, and chronicles. It coexisted with Arabic, which remained especially important for religion and many fields of knowledge, so that bilingual worlds were common in scholarly circles. Persian did not replace local languages in the regions where it spread. It often sat atop a multilingual reality, with Turkic languages in military and steppe contexts, and a variety of local languages in everyday speech. Further south, crossing the mountains and valleys of the Indian subcontinent, an even more complex linguistic reality awaited the traveler. The subcontinent was never a single language world, and this diversity did not disappear. South Asia remains one of the most multilingual regions in the world. During much of the Middle Ages, Sanskrit remained the most important prestige language for scholarly writing, religion, and elite culture. It was not the everyday speech of most communities, but it mattered because it traveled. Scholars, poets, and officials trained in Sanskrit could communicate across regions in a way that local speech often did not allow. At the same time, the Middle Ages saw the rise of regional languages as written and literary languages in their own right. In the south, Tamil had a deep classical tradition, while Kannada, Telugu, and Malayalam developed rich medieval literatures and courtly use. Across the north and east of the subcontinent, ancestral languages of Bengali and forms of Hindi became increasingly visible in poetry and religious writing intended for broader audiences. In the far east of this vast continent, a radically different solution had been found for the challenge of interregional communication. During most of the medieval period, the greatest constant in China was the written language. Educated people used classical Chinese for government, scholarship, and formal writing, and because Chinese characters are not tied to a single pronunciation, the same text could be read across the entire extent of the empire, even when people in different regions did not speak the same way. Spoken Chinese, however, was never a single language. Regional speech continued to drift over the centuries, and these differences gradually deepened, especially between northern and southern varieties. Mandarin has its roots in the speech of the north, which gained influence as northern capitals shaped broader forms of communication. Cantonese dates back to the speech of the far south, centered in Guangzhou, which grew in regional importance as southern cities and trade networks expanded. And this influence of written Chinese would not remain confined within the empire's borders. Throughout medieval East Asia, classical Chinese functioned as the regional prestige written language for government, scholarship, and diplomacy, even in places where no one spoke Chinese as a native language. In Japan, early writing relied heavily on Chinese characters, called kanji, but scribes developed ways to adapt the characters to Japanese speech, and by around the 9th century, Japanese writers were already producing important works in a written form closer to spoken Japanese. In Korea, Chinese characters dominated formal writing for much of the medieval period, but a major change occurred in the 15th century when the court of the Joseon dynasty created Hangul, a phonetic alphabet designed to write Korean more directly. In Vietnam, classical Chinese was the language of government and scholarship for centuries, while Vietnamese developed Chu Nom, a character system adapted to the local language. Traveling through medieval East Asia, one repeatedly found the same division, a shared written culture linked to China at the May, top and deeply local spoken languages shaping daily life everywhere. But there was a world that defied all these fixed categories, a world in constant motion where language followed the trail of conquests and caravans. Across the great Eurasian steppes, which stretched from the Black Sea to Mongolia, language was shaped by mobility. Steppe empires and confederations linked enormous distances through diplomacy, war, and trade, and travelers frequently encountered Turkic languages as some of the most widespread spoken tongues. The Mongol expansions of the 13th century added another major layer. Mongol became politically important in an immense imperial network, and Mongol rulers administered multilingual populations from China to the Middle East and Eastern Europe. Even within territories ruled by the Mongols, everyday communication often remained local, so that the influence of Mongol coexisted with Turkic languages on the steppe and with Persian, Chinese, and many other languages in sedentary regions. Because the steppe connected so many worlds, it also produced constant multilingual contact. Merchants, envoys, and soldiers moved between languages, and empires relied on translators and mixed communities in frontier cities and caravan routes. In practical terms, the steppe was less about a single steppe language and more about overlapping lingua francas, with Mongol at the height of Mongol power and the main written languages dominating the neighboring sedentary empires. And yet, even after traversing all these great languages of power and prestige, the portrait of the medieval world would be incomplete without recognizing the voices that were never suppressed by the advance of these dominant languages. The medieval world was full of other important languages, some linked to strong regional cultures, others to long-distance trade or cohesive communities. In Western Europe, travelers could still find Celtic languages, like Irish, Welsh, and Breton. In northern Iberia, Basque persisted as a distinct language, unrelated to neighboring Romance languages, part of the region's everyday linguistic panorama throughout the entire Middle Ages. Around the eastern Mediterranean and the Caucasus, large communities used languages with their own long-written traditions, including Armenian and Georgian. Further north and east, travelers could find speakers of Finno-Ugric languages, ancestors of Finnish and Estonian, living alongside Scandinavian and Slavic neighbors in border regions where people often learned more than one language to get along. Some languages also traveled because communities carried them beyond borders. Hebrew, for example, was widely used for Jewish religious and intellectual life throughout the medieval world, even when everyday conversation took place in the local language of wherever one lived. In the Jewish quarters of Toledo, in the communities of Troy, in the markets of Cairo, or in the synagogues of Baghdad, Hebrew was the thread that stitched a scattered diaspora into a single literate tradition. The picture that emerges is not that of an orderly linguistic pyramid, with one language at the top and all others below. It is rather a dense tapestry, overlapping and constantly changing, where great prestige languages provided instruments of reach and communication, but never extinguished the rich web of regional and community languages that shaped daily life everywhere. The medieval world was, above all, a world of multiple voices. In every market, in every port, in every pilgrimage route, the air was filled with words that crossed borders, exchanged meanings, and transformed both the languages and the people who spoke them. A monk reading Latin in Northumbria, a merchant negotiating in Persian along the Oxus River, a child learning Chinese characters in Korea, a scribe copying texts in Ge'ez in the Ethiopian mountains. Each of them inhabited a particular linguistic universe and at the same time was part of something much larger. Languages are not just tools for communication, they are living archives of human experience. They carry within them the traces of migrations, conquests, trade exchanges, and faith. And the study of how they were born, traveled, transformed, and sometimes disappeared is, at its heart, the study of how human beings constructed and reconstructed the world around them. The medieval world we explored in this documentary is not as distant as it seems. Every time someone speaks Portuguese, Spanish, French, or Italian, the Latin of medieval monasteries echoes. Every time someone reads a text in classical Arabic, they touch the same language that connected Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba. Every time someone learns Japanese or Korean, they follow the footsteps of medieval scribes who adapted entire writing systems to give voice to languages that did not fit the molds they had received. The languages we inherit are the legacy of choices made by people who lived centuries ago. Choices about what to write, what to preserve, what to transmit, and what to transform. And each of those choices left a mark that we can still hear if we know how to listen. If this dive into the languages of the medieval world has awakened in you the same curiosity that moves us to explore and narrate these stories, then you already know what to do. Subscribe to the channel and become part of this community of listeners who are not content with the silence of the past. Like this video so that more people can find these stories, and leave in the comments which of the medieval languages we explored today caught your attention the most. After all, every great discovery begins with someone who decided to pay attention to a word the world forgot.